The Giants will visit the Chargers in Week 14 on December 12th. LA went 7-9 in 2020. And to get more into what to expect from the Chargers this season, we are now joined by the Chargers radio play-by-play announcer, Matt Money Smith. Matt, you got Lance Medow and Paul Dottino here on Giants.com, Big Blue Kickoff Live. Greatly appreciate the time today. Hope all is well on your end. How are things?
Things are good. Lance, Paul, I'm excited. You know, we got, a couple weeks here till we get things really rolling and get out and see these guys that went out to the rookie camp and the mini camp. And there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of enthusiasm around this new coaching staff, around the second year of Justin Herbert. You can just kind of feel it. You know, sometimes you guys done this long enough. You kind of can take the temperature of camp just based on body language and maybe how the guys are behaving as they're just walking around and talking with one another. And it certainly feels like this one's got a lot of energy going into the 2021 campaign.
There's no doubt about it, and I think you have every right to be excited, especially with Herbert coming off of an offensive Rookie of the Year performance. I want to get to Herbert in a second, but I actually want to start with what I think, Matt, is the biggest storyline, and that's the environment that they're providing for their quarterback. The Chargers were very aggressive this offseason, improving that offensive line. They bring in Corey Linsley and Matt Filer, two proven veterans. They draft Rashawn Slater. How much of what they've done up front do you think can really take Herbert to a whole new level in year two?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, Lance, it's interesting, right? Because they had arguably the worst offensive line in the league last year, right? And Herbert operated as a top 10 quarterback behind it, despite being under pressure, despite having as little time to throw as any quarterback in the league. And it's interesting. So I don't know how much better can he get with a league average offensive line. And I mean, no doubt he's going to be excited that there's better protection in front of him. But, I think really what contributed to that 7-9 record as opposed to maybe a 9-7 or a 10-6 more than anything was defensive letdowns. You know, Herbert ended up having 5 fourth-quarter leads that the defense surrendered. Certainly the offensive line needed fixing. It was leaky. I mean, it was a sieve, and he was constantly under pressure. But he still delivered. And so that's, I think, where a lot of that excitement that you're talking about is coming from is, man, this is someone that was get through for 4,300 yards, broke every rookie record in the book, 30-plus touchdowns to just 10 interceptions, and he did it behind one of the worst units in the league. What can we imagine? I just don't know how much more markedly improved he could be from what we saw last year.
Before we get to the X's and O's of the roster, let me ask you about head coach Brandon Staley and what you think he brings to the table.
Well, Paul, I'll tell you, first of all, I think the defensive scheme's going to be a lot better. Last year, and I loved, I think the players love Gus. Everybody loves Gus Bradley. He's a great guy, an awesome coach, but it felt like the get home in 4, no matter what, be damned. If we don't get there, we don't get there. It just stopped working. I think is probably the best way to put it. And he started blitzing a little bit more later in the season. But as I mentioned, it just seemed repeatedly, if the opposing offense had the ball at the end of the game, you did not feel good about what the outcome was going to look like. You felt a heck of a lot better if you were behind and the Chargers offense had the ball than you did the defense having to protect the lead. So scheme, number 1. 2, a healthy Derwin James, obviously, with Brandon Staley. And you saw what he did with Jalen Ramsey and that Rams defense last year. I think what people maybe don't realize is, the Rams defense wasn't just good last year. It wasn't just great. It was historically good.
Sure.
It was one of the best defenses we've seen in like 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it. That unit was top-notch, especially with who they were throwing out in the secondary. And since you brought up the defensive side of the ball, I mean, let's stick there at least for the time being. Unfortunately, Matt, as you can attest to, I always make the joke, and tongue-in-cheek, somebody's got to put the voodoo doll down that's toying with the Chargers defense. I mean, Matt, it's getting ridiculous. Every year we're so enamored with all the names, the Derwin Jameses, the Joey Bosa's, and unfortunately we never see what this unit could do because they don't have the 11 guys at their disposal. I know you don't have a crystal ball, and we have no idea how this season is going to play out, but how imperative is it truly, in order for this defense to reach its high expectations, regardless of what scheme Brandon Staley is running, is that this unit finally can rely on the 11 guys that they anticipate is going to be the staple of this defense?
That's a great point, Lance. I mean, it's the most important point, really, because there is not great depth, and that's what's got him, right? In years past, you said, Derwin goes down, and there's really not a great answer there at safety. They end up moving Rashawn Jenkins from free back to strong. And then they put Nasir Adderley at free, who just was not comfortable playing that particular position in Gus Bradley's scheme. So they need depth. Hopefully they have better depth. But I think it comes down to health. If those 11 guys are healthy, I think Drew Tranquill is really going to open some eyes this year. Unfortunately, he snapped the leg at the start of messed up his leg at the start of the season in the first game. But I think the pairing of he and Kenneth Murray at linebacker, obviously what Joey Bosa can do. He's probably the most complete defensive end in the league in terms of stopping the run and just blowing up plays and getting the quarterback. And obviously Derwin's a key. But beyond that, there's not a lot of depth. They're going to rely on a rookie at corner in Asante Samuel Jr. to play with Chris Harris and Mikey Quince. And once you get beyond that, that's kind of always the boo about this roster is if too many guys go down, you just, and that happened to the offensive line last year. It's why it was the worst unit in the league. There's just not a lot of reinforcements. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of teams in the NFL.
I had seen a comment, from Justin Herbert coming out of the minicamp that during those practices, he saw a lot of different guys playing a lot of different positions, and the versatility seemed to be much more of an emphasis this year. I'm going to assume that's because of the lack of depth. They figure, look, we probably got to get as many guys in as many spots as we can because that would give them a chance to compete.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. I think if you talk about Nasir Adderley, who I just mentioned, played free safety exclusively, played that high safety, in Gus's scheme last year exclusively. You're hearing Brandon Staley talk about him playing some slot corner, playing some nickel, playing, both safety positions, just kind of moving him all over the field. I think the same goes with Kenneth Murray. You'll probably see him move to a couple different linebacker positions, and that likely is a product of, I think, his scheme and the idea that he wants offenses to have to react to him instead of him having to react to offenses. He's always preached that. Create that confusion pre-snap, post-snap as much as you can. So I think there's a little bit of, protect yourself depth-wise, but also create mismatches, create confusion pre-snap and during a play and not quite knowing where pressure's coming from, who's dropping, who's playing where. So I think a lot of that goes hand in hand on that side of the ball.
We're talking with Chargers radio play-by-play announcer Matt Money Smith here on Giants.com, Big Blue Kickoff Live. Speaking of depth, that brings me, Matt, to the wide receiver core because Herbert, I thought, did a really nice job spreading the wealth last season despite some of the issues that he had up front. And while we know what Keenan Allen could do and we've seen Mike Williams, one guy that I want to focus on is Tyron Johnson, who really flashed here or there, it seemed, last season. Huge target down the field, 19.9 yards per reception that he averaged. Where do you see his development and perhaps the bigger role that he could carve out for himself entering this season?
Yeah, they call him T-Billy, and I'm so used to having everybody say that when I ask about Tyron. So forgive me if I try to use the nickname here like I did with Mike Davis a second ago. So I do think there's probably a wide open competition for that third receiver. Jalen Guyton's got speed. Tyron's got speed. They drafted Josh Palmer. They're really excited about him and just kind of his complete receiver sort of. He's a really good route runner. He's got strong hands. So I think the rookie's going to be in the mix as well. I'll be honest, I was a little surprised that they didn't go out and get one of those sort of, I don't want to degrade the free agent, but just kind of like that not quite top but mid-tier receiver like a Marvin Jones. It just felt like one of those guys was really going to put this receiving core over the top, and I think it probably speaks to how much confidence they had, especially late in the season, in Johnson and Guyton, that one of them can be that third receiver. It's going to be interesting because they need. I think Herbert's shown that he needs that speed guy, take the top off, and he's willing to stand in there and take the shot that he's got to take in order to put that thing down the field. I mean, you mentioned Johnson in the 19. My gosh, that thing was at like 32 per catch for about 6 games because I think he had 3 or 4 60-plus catches, 60-plus yard catches. So that's the key, right? You got to have that speed to try to open things up and allow Keenan not to get doubled and do his magic in a route running term. Mike Williams is a great 50-50 guy, but doesn't quite have that speed. So, again, Lance, I think you hit it right on the head. That's probably going to be the one guy that if he can take that next step can really bring, I think, this receiving core into the conversation as one of the most complete, better ones in the league.
Well, you're talking about the passing game, and Jared Cook, who seems to have a suitcase with him everywhere he goes because he's just been on so many teams, He lands there now as a replacement for Hunter Henry, and I wonder what you think his role will be. I mean, the guy certainly has a lot of wear on his tires.
Yeah, I think Paul, I think had Hunter been able to stay healthy and not had so many injury issues with the Chargers, they would have absolutely kept him. Full service tight end. They loved him, someone who could block and catch. That's not the case with Jarrett. And I think that's why you saw him draft Trey McKitty, and they're excited about him as kind of that complete tight end. So what I would imagine is, and it's interesting, Justin didn't really use Hunter as much as we thought he would. Like you said, Lance, he really spread it around. When you look at the touchdown totals, there wasn't the one guy with 12, 13 touchdowns, and, you look in the red zone, and he's looking his way and throwing. His targets are considerably higher than the next guy. Now, obviously, target-wise, Keenan Allen got a ton just because he's that reliable and he's as good a go-to as there is in the league. But I'm interested to see if Jared Cook can almost be more productive than Hunter Henry was last year, because we just never quite saw that relationship develop like Phillip Rivers had with his tight ends. Whenever you got in the red zone, we always knew, probably option one for Phillip was going to be his tight end, and that just never quite developed last year with Herbert and Hunter. So I'm anxious to see if, especially Jared Cook coming over and having been in that Joe Lombardi offense with the Saints for quite a while, and that's going to be pretty much the foundation and the nucleus of this offense. So he'll be comfortable. I'm anxious to see if they can get the tight end a little bit more run here.
Matt, I'm glad you brought up Joe Lombardi and the connection with Jared Cook, because in addition to you referring to Brandon Staley perhaps dramatically changing the defense, we also need to account for, there's a new staff on the offensive side of the ball, and Lombardi was the Saints QB coach for the last few seasons. What would you best describe perhaps what he will do for Herbert, or how similar and how different it may look from what they ran under Anthony Lynn and company?
I'll share. I'll just kind of go ahead and take it from Drew Brees. He was out at camp, kind of prepping for his media and going through faux production meetings with the guys, and so he was able to talk with us for a little while. And when we brought up, what he could share with us about what he expected Lombardi to do with Herbert, I thought he put it perfectly. He said, "Imagine the offense is the biggest menu you've ever seen at a restaurant." And I think anybody that's been to a Cheesecake Factory immediately thinks of that menu. And he said what Lombardi does is, and Sean Payton does, is they present you with all of these options, and you work through all of these things, and then they end up narrowing that down to about 30% of what you do really well. And I think bringing in Shane Day as QB coach from the Shanahan offense, they've kind of said that that's probably 25% of this thing, and Lombardi's about 75% of this thing. So what I think Justin does best is obviously deliver a deep ball, right, with that arm. But also, I think you're going to probably see more mobility, which we didn't see a lot of in, the Saints offense. It was more rhythm, right, with Drew. But I think Herbert is such an athlete. It feels like they want to take advantage of that. At least that's kind of the sort of the subtle hints that you're getting from Coach Staley when he talks about it, and just applying pressure on a defense. And there's no better way to do that than having to account for the mobility and athleticism of a quarterback. So I think you're going to see a lot of that. There's also, I'll make this long answer longer, there was also a mic'd up moment with Lombardi talking to Justin Jackson, the running back. And Jackson was coming out of the backfield, and he kind of did a little shimmy and tried to break outside on this pass that was coming from Herbert. And he pulled him aside and he said, "Hey, look, man, I don't need anything fancy. I want you to take what's there so we can get this thing moving." He's like, "You got plenty of time to do that in the open field." He goes, "But just look, plant your foot here. There's the slant. Let's get this ball out of his hands." So that to me was an indication that, okay, there's that Saints offense, right? Find the mismatch, get to it immediately, and let your playmakers make the play, as opposed to a quarterback holding pat and trying to see something develop.
Where does Austin Eckler fit into this? I mean, I know he had the hamstring last year, and obviously that limited his ability to get on the field, but we're still looking at a guy who over the last 3 seasons has had between 500 and 600 yards rushing apiece, and has not really taken it to the next level. Again, I understand injuries were a part of that last season.
Yeah, Paul, I'll tell you, in the last couple of years, when we'd be down on the field with, I'd be there with my analyst, Daniel Jeremiah, talking to opposing coaches, that's the first name they'd bring up. That's the guy they were most concerned about. He is so good. And I think, if he can stay healthy, I expect him to have a heck of a year. I'm not saying he's Alvin Kamara at all, but that's, he never goes down on first contact. His hands are as reliable as any, I think, at the running back position when it comes to catching balls. You'll see wheel routes that he's snatching balls out of the air 20 yards down the field like a receiver. So I expect them to see how much of that Kamara role he can take on. He's obviously not as big. He's a smaller guy, but pound for pound, he's the strongest guy on the team. So I do think he's going to end up being a vital part. I would almost... I think you got probably Keenan Allen at 1, and I think he might be 1A when it comes to who do you expect to have the most touches and most impact on this particular offense.
Matt, we've been talking about the theme of depth across the board because, unfortunately, all the injuries that have plagued the Chargers in recent history. And with Eckler going down, we saw some of Justin Jackson and Joshua Kelly. And I think you could argue maybe the yardage per carry wasn't where they had hoped. But part of that, of course, is the offensive line play, too. Really a two-part answer. Number one, how do they feel about the guys behind Eckler with a little bit more experience under their belt? And number two, how much does the improved offensive line, you think, perhaps help elevate the overall run productivity this season?
Yeah, I'll go number 2 first, Lance. It's going to help incredibly. That's, like I mentioned, Herbert was able to overcome the pressure. The running game wasn't. Those guys were getting pushed, particularly at the center position. Dan Feeney was just getting blown up in the middle of that line, and it was really hard for lanes to open for these guys. So that, I think, is going to improve dramatically, even more than I really believe. I think it's going to help more than the passing game. It's like I said, as much pressure as Herbert was under, the run game I think is going to benefit greatly. 2, they love Justin Jackson. It's the same kind of, like, I feel like we, when it comes to the Chargers, we can have this conversation about everyone, right? He's got to stay healthy, and like that was something that I asked Tom Telesco going into the draft. I said, look, every single year, the Chargers have had to pull someone off waivers, off someone's practice squad that ends up starting a game at running back. That's how bad the injuries have plagued that position. Last year it was Balaj. Every single year, Williams was 2 years prior, and I think it just continues to be their sort of steadfast belief that Eckler and Justin Jackson can be as good a tandem as the league might see if they could just stay healthy, because both of them are so well-rounded. Both of them are so freaking tough. They never go down on first contact. They both have great vision. They both have great speed. So I think, again, it's a cross-your-fingers sort of situation with those two, and unfortunately history says that they're probably not going to play 17 games. And I'll be anxious to see how Roundtree fits into that mix and Josh Kelly fits into that mix, because I don't think you're keeping 4 running backs. But who knows? Maybe that's their solution is depth and less reps overall for each of these guys.
Matt, it does sound like they've done a lot to try to help themselves on offense and on defense, but their unspecial teams from last year certainly need an awful lot of work and a lot of upgrading. What do you think they have done during the offseason to give themselves a sporting chance for a unit that is 1/3 of the game?
Yeah, Paul, I'll tell you, of all the coaches that Brandon Staley hired, I think Darius Swinton's probably the one that I'm most excited about. There's something about that guy. They got him from Arizona, and Coach Stu was sort of a mentor, was kind of that old sage of the coaching staff under Anthony Lynn. But man, the special teams was terrible, and a lot of that is players. And Tom Telesco tried to take some responsibility for that. You had Pro Bowl special teams players. Nick DeZubner, Derek Watt, that ended up signing elsewhere that they chose not to keep and tried to replace with rookies that just simply did not pan out. Josh Kelly was. He was abhorrent. I mean, he was terrible on special teams last year. And so I think you saw with their draft a lot of guys that you can envision playing a big role on special teams. Now, the one thing they did get by the end of the year, they found that Nas Adderley's a returner. He's a legit returner, and they have been searching for one for a while. So I won't be surprised if he ends up being their full-time return guy, and I think that's going to help. And I would just imagine having a new coach, some new blood, that these guys are look, they can't be worse. I think it was the worst special teams unit in 30 years. So I can't imagine it's that bad. And I think you're going to have wide open competitions at kicker and punter. And as much as everybody loves Mike Badgley, the kicker, and he had a great year when they went 12-4 and was nails seemingly every time he had to make a kick. Man, he had a rough year last year. I mean, rough. He was the worst kicker over 40 yards. Inside 40, he was fine, but come on, that's the NFL. You got to be good inside 50, and that just was not the case last year for Badgley. And the problem with Badgley is he doesn't do kickoffs. For whatever reason, even though he's got a pretty strong leg, kickoffs, he just can't quite get it down. So I think you're going to see a wide-open kicking competition, and they're probably going to want to find someone that can kick off and make field goals, because that way they can have more of an open competition at punter. Because right now, Ty Long does kickoffs. He's great at that. Did not have a good year punting the ball last year. So I think you're going to see open competitions and perhaps changes at both of those positions for 2021.
As it stands now, do you think they might have potential answers inside the roster, or are they going to be looking at the waiver wire rather heavily?
Paul, I don't know. Because, that's where Badgley came from. They had a competition, 4 years ago, and boy, that could not have gone worse. And you guys remember it because both teams were 0-4 when we came in MetLife. And it was Younghoe Koo of all guys, right? One of the best kickers in the league last year, who just, first two games, he knocks off Josh Lambo in training camp. Lambo's now in Jacksonville, one of the best kickers in the league. Koo, misses 2 kicks in Denver. They lose that first game. Misses a game-winning kick against Miami in week 2. They lose that game. And, next thing you know, Mike Badgley's here off the waiver wire and has been here since. So I don't know if that answer's on the roster, if they're just going to keep looking. I think obviously I think if you ask Tom Telesco, what do you prefer? He says, well, I prefer that, Badgley figure out what the heck went on last year and get back to, what he did in 2019. Or 2018, I should say. I don't know. I'm sorry. I hate to give you an I don't know answer, but I'm not quite sure.
Matt, if there's been 2 clouds hovering over the Chargers, I think we've tackled 2 of them, which is the injury bug, and then, of course, as you just relayed, the special teams unit. And as a result of those 2 factors, I would say the third cloud has been they've played a lot of close games over the course of recent history, and unfortunately, the ball just has not bounced their way. I was actually crunching the numbers. 12 games they played last season, decided by 8 points or less. And the record was 5-7, which I'm sure many people would say, well, teams could do a lot worse. But it just seems as if more often than not, it never goes in favor of them. The reason I'm bringing that up is I'm not a big believer, Matt, that just because you struggle one season in one area, it carries over. Just seems as if it's impacted the Chargers in a unique way. How much do they need, and how much does Brandon Staley need to emphasize that they have to sort of find a way to just shake that narrative since it's plagued them so much?
Yeah, Lance, I'll tell you, I think that's one of the reasons why they decided to make a change at coach. Even though they finished, with 4 straight wins, Justin Herbert had this remarkable rookie season. The offense, well, why are you changing the offense on this kid after he just got comfortable in this one and put up those kind of numbers? But I think it was, sort of that inevitability that the other shoe was going to drop. There was not confidence on this team. It felt like they were just waiting, and we felt it as a broadcast team. I can remember, and you just want to call the game straight. You never want to insert yourself into the storyline, but man, there was a moment. It was late in the season. I think it was against the Raiders with the Chargers. The famous "I was in," call from Justin Herbert on the rush there. And I said, I got to wait. I said, when we were calling the game, I said, look, we think he was in. It looks like he's in, but I'm not going to call this game is over until I get that official to come out from underneath that hood and tell me that this game is over, because it just felt like it was inevitable that they were going to say, yeah, no, we could see a couple strands of thread from his pants were on the ground and he wasn't in. That's just kind of the way it broke. And I think with the new blood, that the players, like I said when we started this conversation, man, they're excited. They believe in this. They believe in the coaches. They believe in the scheme. They believe they're going to be in positions to make plays. And it just felt like last year, especially on defense, they just believed no matter how hard they played, at some point there was going to be a bust in coverage or in tackling, and they were going to lose the game. And man, that's a tough thing to overcome when that seed is planted, in the back of your brain in a game that's played this fast and this violently.
Sometimes, and we've noticed it over the last several years, the schedule can actually play a little bit more havoc with a team than maybe you'd like it to, because you just get a bad draw. Now, this year, you guys draw the NFC East, which has not been a great division over the last few years. How do you feel the Chargers look at their schedule right now, the way it falls, at least during the preseason? We all know things will change during the season, but do they think that the schedule makers gave them a decent run here?
Well, I'll just give you my opinion, Paul, because they'll tell you they love the way it looks, right? But I mean, they're going to start against one of the nastiest fronts in the league, if not the nastiest, right, in Washington.
Yeah.
And you got a brand new offensive line, and you know how important that is. The old 5 fingers on a glove. They got to get comfortable with one another, develop that chemistry, and man, that is tough when you got that coming at you. So that's a tough start to me, especially because it's going to be, a trip to the East Coast, the old 10 a.m. Pacific time start. And then you followed up with arguably, the most explosive offense in the league in the Dallas Cowboys. So even though the NFC East was, down last year, you're still talking about really darn good units that individually can impact the game. The one thing I'll say about the Chargers last year, Lance, and kind of, crunching the numbers and getting a look at it is the quality of competition never fazed them. They should have won that game against the Saints on Monday night. I mean, it's a Mike Badgley kick. Justin Herbert makes the throw, and all you got to do is make a field goal, and that game is over. So, I'm not playing the what-if game. I'm just saying, hey, a kicker in the NFL and a 49-yard field goal, you got to make that. You win the game. Justin Herbert traded punches with Tom Brady that whole game. He took a lead. They were up by 3 touchdowns. Then the defense, blew a couple to start the second half. He falls behind, and what does he do? He drives the team right down the field and gives them a lead in the fourth quarter. So, this team was able to play really well. I mean, heck, look at his first start against Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, right? The guy ends up rushing for a touchdown. They go to overtime, and they lose on 2 63-yard field goals from Butker. So they were good against good competition. And I think that's maybe something, they always say nothing carries over from the prior year, right? But I got to believe that's something that's going to carry over, that, hey, man, we traded punches with the best, and we're able to win any of these games as long as we just execute a little bit better.
Well, I can tell you, Matt, Giants fans can relate to the heartbreak of losing games on lengthy kicks because they've had their fair share of issues
Been that way for a few
in that department too. Yes, so there's multiple franchises that certainly can relate to what the Chargers have gone through. Matt, before we let you go, another big picture question, because obviously you've covered the league very closely over your years in NFL broadcasting. The Giants are playing the AFC West, and I think over the last few years, a lot of people point to it's the Chiefs division, Kansas City's the standard, they're going to run away with things. I would personally make an argument, as you pointed out in this conversation, the Chargers are on the rise. Denver's got a really good defense. They're returning a lot of players due to injury. And the Raiders, will see what becomes of their defense, as that unit obviously struggled immensely. What do you make of the overall AFC West, and how much better do you think the division is overall?
It's a really tough division. We know the Chiefs might be top to bottom, the best team or the second best team behind the Buccaneers in the league. And then when you have Patrick Mahomes, that just, compounds your issues that you have trying to beat them. Starts there. I think they're going to be a tough team to topple. Now, you mentioned the Broncos. It's been interesting. They've also have been the injury team, right?
Yeah.
And you look at them on paper, and they look great, and then Von Miller goes down, and Courtland Sutton goes down. It just seems like every year they lose guys, and that's an issue. The one thing about the Broncos that I don't buy into, that everybody seemed to celebrate, was just how much better this offensive line got. In the 2 games that the Chargers played them, I didn't see that. I did not feel that. It felt like Bosa was wrecking Garrett Bowles the entire game, and that offensive line was not holding up against the Chargers. So, with Teddy Bridgewater there, maybe the ball gets out a little bit quicker as opposed to Drew Lock, and maybe that was a bit of an issue against the Chargers, that Bosa's just so good. You got to speed your clock up a little bit. And then for the Raiders, I'm just... I don't get what they did. I just don't quite understand. The one thing they were able to do is they were the bully in the league, with that offensive line when it came to offense. Man, that thing was nasty. It was big. It was strong. It was experienced. The defensive line would always talk about, just the fight they were in. And Derek Carr never held the ball long. It was always out. And he had enough protection for that. And that offense was tough to deal with. So I don't know what that's going to look like now. With Derek Carr, you light him up a little bit, and that game changes in a hurry. And I'm anxious to see if trying to save some money on the O-line so they could go out and spend it on defense, if that ends up coming back to negate a strength in order to try to make a defense at least just average that's been so bad as of late. I mean, if I were just kind of ranking it, I think you hit it, Lance. I think you're talking Chiefs are the gold standard, and I think right behind them, if they can stay healthy is the Chargers. And then, the Broncos will be health dependent. I feel like the Raiders are the fourth best team in this division.
No, I think that's an accurate assessment, as the Giants will be trying to solve the AFC West riddle this season, including an up-and-coming Chargers team led by Justin Herbert. He is the Chargers radio play-by-play announcer, Matt Money Smith. Matt, can't thank you enough. Greatly appreciate the time and the insight. Look forward to following the Chargers this season, and also look forward to talking to you down the road. Thanks again.
Stay well, Matt.
Anytime. Absolutely, Paul. Thank you, Lance. Take care.
You as well.